Good afternoon. It is Friday, January 10th. This is Joe McHugh with Liberty Strikes Back, and I am providing to you a proof of the Iran scam, that video that I did yesterday. Now, so there were some comments on the video, and some of the comments included that the plane was shot down by a missile. I find it ironic that the comments were made in a very authoritative tone, because that there has been no proof, and that is typically how the authoritarian regime tends to work. So anyway, the comments included a missile attack on the plane, that the holes in the plane, as seen here are the holes in the plane. Yeah, there's some holes, these are holes. And those holes were apparently caused by shrapnel, presumably inflicted after the supposed missile hit the plane. And I have no doubt that there is some good evidence for shrapnel doing that. It's probably the same evidence that was used in the magic bullet case that killed JFK. Let's just call this magic shrapnel instead. And so, another question was whether or not the plane, the plane supposedly, this person has information that the plane reached a height of 8,000 meters, or 8,000 feet rather. The plane did, according to this UK report, the plane reached a height of 2,400 meters, which is 2.4 kilometers. Where is it here? Let me show you this report. Here it is. Flight data. Flight data shows the plane reached an altitude of 2.4 kilometers, which is 2,400 meters. So the question is whether or not a 50 caliber machine gun can take down a target at a distance of 2,400 meters. And I know from my time in the Marine Corps that the maximum effective range of a 50 caliber machine gun is 2,000 meters, right? So this is what you call a maximum effective range when it's mounted on a tripod. But the maximum range is actually 6.8 kilometers, or 6,800 meters, which means that if the plane reached a maximum height of 2.4 kilometers, it is well within the maximum range. It's just beyond the maximum effective range, meaning your accuracy is going to be slightly off. Now, let's talk a little bit about how this could have worked, because another argument was that the plane was traveling at 300 miles per hour, and at that distance, it's too difficult to hit. But that's presuming that the plane was not hit anywhere earlier in the takeoff. So if we look at the Iranian airport here, and we look at, this is a distance, an elevation of 0 versus an elevation of 6,800 meters, and the plane here is at an elevation or a max height of 2,400 meters. That means that this gray area here is the max effective range of 2,000 meters. And so that means that if it's at a height of 2,400 meters, that it's more likely than not that the plane was riddled with bullets as it was ascending until it reached that 2,400 meter flight, or max height. So, quick math, 2,400 meters times 3 is about 8,000 feet, just short of 8,000 feet, somewhere around there. And typically planes fly at an altitude of 15 to 30,000 feet. So it was still in the ascent, and it had quite a bit longer to go before it reached its maximum, its cruising altitude. But even if it did get beyond the 2,400 meters or 8,000 feet, notice that the maximum range, granted the accuracy will suffer the further away you get, but the maximum range of a 50 caliber tripod mounted machine gun is over 4 miles. It's 6,800 meters. So theoretically, the plane could have been hit all the way up to here. Now, granted, again, if you have a truck mounted 50 caliber machine gun, as seen in this picture here, the more likely positioning or more appropriate positioning would have been as kind of probably underneath the plane as it was taking off, so that you had a good target. And it would have taken some time before that plane caught fire. So let's go back and look at the photos, and you can see that it's kind of along the side for those photos there. Um, let's see if there are any other bullet photos that show where exactly it was. We can't tell exactly where that is. This looks like it was kind of on the side. That one actually caught a couple up top. So, we don't know what it looked like on the bottom, but these are the ones that we can see, and that hit again, we don't know if that's the top or the bottom of that wing. But so clearly this shows that it is well within the range of a 50 caliber machine gun. Those bullet holes look like the size of a 50 caliber round. And so the most likely scenario is that it was a 50 caliber gun that was used to bring down the plane. And there are not any massive holes related to missiles. There does not appear to be any independently verified wreckage related to a missile, only that there are 50 caliber sized rounds, holes in the actual side of the plane. So once again, the plane could very well easily have been taken down by a truck-mounted 50 caliber machine gun, is well within the max effective range, and so that is to say that it's beyond that range is not accurate. To say that it was brought down by a missile, there's no evidence for it. To say that it was traveling too fast, I'd say that's probably not accurate either. And then finally, there was another argument made against whether or not it makes sense that the U.S. wanted to, now that we are a net oil exporter, that whether or not it made sense that we were still seeking to control the oil markets. Now, this is where I was not able to find the report, but back in 2003, when I was researching the 9/11 attacks, and I found the Rebuilding America's Defenses report, which talked about the new Pearl Harbor and the inside job, or rather what was going to be needed as indicated by the new Pearl Harbor to rebuild America's defenses. I also found a report around that time that was talking about resource scarcity and a global threat. And it talked about the resource wars that would come from this resource scarcity. Now, wasn't able to find the report in particular, which said that we would be able to manage the resource scarcity problem with political, diplomatic, military, and economic means. But it did say in that report that our objective was to exhaust the world's resources before using our own. And now I wasn't able to find that, but I'm sure that if there are enough of you out there, I'm not the only person who read that report, and I'm sure somebody else might be able to reproduce it. But in other words, in the absence of that report, what we do have here is another 2003 report that talks about resource scarcity as a global security threat. This one was produced by the Europeans, and it talks, here's a 2004 report, high-level panel on threats, climates, or challenges, and change, specifically referring to resource shortages and water, as well as oil and that sort of thing. So the report is out there. I simply can't find it at this point, but this is it's at the same time as this report was filed, and so you can look up this report and talk about others and see if you can find it on your own. Now, that being said, we do have an objective, and we did not start exporting oil until 2014. And if you want to know more about that and the process for exporting oil as it relates to Iran and Ukraine, you can go ahead and watch my Ukraine video. And I do explain and talk about that in terms of controlling the oil markets. And we do have a vested interest in making sure that if oil is produced, that we have access and control over it. Resource control is a stated objective of the American military and the American intelligence apparatus that is managing the military-industrial complex, resource control. And so, again, returning to the video that I did yesterday that showed that Iran reached self-sufficiency in 2013 for producing their own resources, oil and gas, and they began to export it to Iraq and Pakistan. That's not what we want to have happen. If anyone, we want them to export that to the United States. And so what we can do is by invading Iran and taking control of their oil resources, as we did with Iraq and Syria, we can have American companies produce the oil and ensure that if the oil doesn't go to the United States, that at least we earn the profits from it. And so now I did mention the cost of these policies and that the average spend has been around $80 billion, and that is a conservative estimate according to one of the generals from the report that I cited yesterday. So I decided to run some numbers because if you take, $80 billion a year and I ran it all the way back from 1991, but I wasn't able to find numbers. But 80 billion, all the way dating back to 1991, would have yielded 2.4 trillion. But we have only numbers dating back to 2003, and you can see there that just taking numbers back from 2003 in terms of a 20% estimate of the defense spend, you're looking at $2.5 trillion, which that we spent on Middle Eastern wars at a minimum just since 2003. So the last 16 years, that's how much we spent. Now, since most of our conflict, again, according to a number of generals in yesterday's report, since most of the conflicts have been in the Middle East, I would say that 100% of our expenses in the Middle East are related to protecting oil and gas, which means that if we have a two-theater military, half of the military is focused on the Middle East, and the other half is focused on East Asia. And I would say that there are reports that show that we haven't shifted as much to East Asia. So even this balanced 50% allocation to the Middle East is probably not accurate. It's probably closer to 75%. But even if we just take the 50% allocation and we look at it from that standpoint and we say that, okay, 50% of the allocation in our defense spend went to the Middle East, and then we're looking at about 6 trillion over the last 16 years, which is much more than the 2.5 trillion, which is a conservative estimate by the generals, as cited in yesterday's report. Now, if we were to take those returns, right? If we were to take, let's say, 20% on the conservative return estimate and the balanced return of 50%, and apply that to the stock market. Now, I'm not suggesting that we take this money and invest it directly into the stock market, but I'm providing this as a point of reference so that you understand what this money could have been worth had we invested it in some way, shape, or form, as opposed to using it on bonds and protecting our oil pipelines, right? So if we had done that, let's see if I can hide these. Let me pause this. Okay, I've got those hidden now so you can see this more easily. But if we had taken the conservative returns, a conservative 20% estimate, and applied a market-based return of 25% to it, this is what we would have had. And we would have totaled $5 trillion, which is double, $5 trillion in assets relative to $2.5 trillion in expenditures. So in other words, it would have been a 7.5 or a $7 trillion swing, $7.5 trillion swing. 200% return, right? So, because it's money that we didn't spend, and instead of have invested it, and we would have ended up with 100% return in terms of traditional metrics, but in terms of opportunity cost, it would have been a 200% return. Now, if you were to apply that 50% to the market-based return, you would have ended up with $13.5 trillion as opposed to the 6.25. Now, investing the money directly into the market is not going to solve the climate crisis, and it would only accomplish inflating the market. And so it really doesn't help anyone except for the investor class. if we are going to get smart about using our money, and again, the best general wins without firing a shot, what we want to do is take a sniper shot here. We want to be accurate in our targeting and the use of funds on the objective, and instead of just spray and pray, that's not going to work. So, what we really need, according to the United Nations, in an article that I'm going to release shortly, is the United Nations estimates that we need between 30 and 50 trillion dollars in investment in order to avert a climate crisis. And again, depending on your perspective, we need to avoid a climate crisis, and may or may not be caused by human involvement. But regardless, we have a responsibility to not pollute because it's simply the right thing to do. And the best approach is to not make a mess in the first place. And so that means that and taking the climate out of consideration 100%, regardless of how you feel about the science, and regardless of whether or not you believe that it's our responsibility to be good stewards, the fact of the matter is we have extreme weather worsening on both ends. From both end, hot and cold extremes are getting worse, and that is not disputed. And we need to improve our infrastructure to become more resilient, because even in the wake of just 2 days after some Puerto Rico quakes, the island is without power, buildings collapsed, and again, this is while the island is still attempting to recover from a hurricane. So this is going to be a situation that becomes increasingly problematic as we move forward. And again, regardless of how you feel about who's causing climate change, the fact of the matter is that extreme weather is here, and that we do need to invest in infrastructure to improve the resilience of our infrastructure in terms of the energy grid, the food supply, our water resources, and our buildings and roads in order to withstand the increased pressures as a result of the extreme weather. And so the way you do that is through a concept called green bonds. And so green bonds, and I put a return of 4.5% because much of this is going to be provided to the consumer. And the consumer, and I'll get into that in a little bit, but this is again a play on my Earth loans concept, in which the objective was to reduce the cost to the consumer for heating, for a carbon-free alternative to home heating and cooling, and so that we can incentivize the consumer to switch to a planet-friendly concept while helping them to save money at the same time. And this is a far better approach than simply mandating and putting the cost on the consumer. All we have to do is shift the price curve. This is economics 101, making it more affordable, and people will go for the cheaper, more cost-effective alternative. Again, aligning planet-friendly options with consumer behavior. And so these green bonds can produce a yield of around 4.5%. And if we take the companies that need to produce those green markets, we're looking at hatching an entire new type of company. These are socially responsible social entrepreneur enterprises, and the venture capital return and average VC return target is 25%. So if we were to take an 80-20 blend, 80% into green bonds and 20% of the money invested into green equity, you would come up with a compound annual growth rate of 8.6%, which that 8.6% matches the market return, the average market return dating back to 2003. And so if we were to do that, then, on a conservative approach, we would produce similar returns. And so this is a way that we can stop spending money on oil and gas and protecting oil and gas, especially now that the U.S. is a net exporter. This is the time where we need to transition off of oil and gas and onto renewables. And this is how you do it, by letting market forces take play in the oil markets, by instead of exporting oil and gas, by using it for domestic consumption, and facilitating and taking the savings from that transition and investing that directly into green bonds and investing into companies which are going to produce these markets, which would save money from a military standpoint. It would produce returns on investment for everyone involved. This can be done through the clean, green, citizen-owned, and fully transparent credit union so that we would eventually own these assets and they would continue to produce returns for all Americans, not just the private bank shareholders of the Federal Reserve. I'll get more into how that will work now that we understand what this means, the returns on investment and what it means. This also would provide outsized returns to decreasing the cost of healthcare, because when you get out of oil and gas and you start investing into renewables and organics, there's just simply less pollution to pollute our bodies, pollute the air, the water, and the food that we consume. And as a result, we the people will be healthier, happier, wealthier, and freer as a result. This is Joe McHugh with Liberty Strikes Back. I want to thank you for your engagement in the video, and you can look forward to the next video, which will explain how a clean, green, citizen-owned credit union in which we all have an equal stake in the economy will actually work. Thank you for watching.